I loved the work. I thought I was doing a good job. I loved the people. I loved the culture of the Port Authority. I arrived at the Port Authority in 1962 at the tender age of 17.
You're right out of high school?
I was directly out of high school.
And you interviewed as a clerk, as a stenographer. What was your role going to be?
I interviewed as a stenographer and I got accepted for the job. I got accepted by several other agencies as well, but I decided to choose the Port Authority because they paid $5 more a week at the time. My starting salary was $71.50 a week.
That's a number I think many younger people have a hard time understanding, that in the early 60s, if someone was making, say, $20,000, they were like a top executive.
Yeah, well, I wasn't making $20,000.
It's an exciting time, the early 60s, in particularly in this region. What did you know about the Port Authority? You were from New Jersey, correct?
Correct. I was from a very small town in New Jersey. I had 93 people in my graduating class. I was from a large Italian family, very protected. And here I am all by myself going to work in New York City. What I knew about the Port Authority was it was the bus terminal. So when I went in for my interview, actually, my teacher brought me in for my interview because I was afraid to go to New York. I was quite surprised to go into this large building, be greeted by a personnel department, be given the test, and interviewed.
Now, for those who are reasonably young, the building you went into is the former headquarters on between 8th and 9th Avenue, correct?
Yes, it's between 8th and 9th Avenue on 15th and 16th Streets.
So what was so you get hired, there's a training process. Are you in a like a large group of young, I assume probably just all women who are hired to be typing? I mean, people didn't have computers. The average person wasn't typing their own letters. Can you talk a little bit about what that beginning was like at the agency for you?
Yes, we arrived, and I say we because I would say there were about 40 to 50 people, most of whom probably were from high school, and at the time there were secretarial schools. We arrived together. We were all gathered in the personnel department. We were put in a large room, and we had over a week's worth of orientation, telling us about the Port Authority, about its mission, about its departments. I had no idea prior to going that the Port Authority operated the tunnels and bridges and the airports and the marine terminals. So there was a big learning curve, but it was very comprehensive. And we were all excited at the end of a week and a half because then we would be assigned to different departments. We had no choices in that matter.
What was your first department?
Aviation Planning Division on the 14th floor.
What was aviation like? There you are, 17 years old, the world of aviation.
The world of aviation opened to me. In the Aviation Planning Division, there were many airport engineers. There were many draftsmen, and they worked together, and there were blueprints and plans. There were great plans for Kennedy, I remember specifically. They were building the Pan Am terminal, the TWA terminal, all of which are now, I don't know what they are because there's no Pan Am or TWA. But Kennedy was big, LaGuardia was big. Newark was this little itty bitty airport with a very, very small little terminal building. And basically, my job was working on jet noise. Jet noise in the communities was a problem. So I worked for the man that worked with cities, he worked with the government, he worked with the airlines to try to decrease the decibels that people were exposed to.
The TWA terminal, by the way, has been restored. It's a
Has it?
hotel. It's a hotel.
Wow, that's exciting.
So how long were you in aviation?
I was in aviation for 6 years, maybe a month shy of 6 years when I got the call. And
What was the call?
I have absolutely no idea how they chose me from the agency, but I got a call asking me to come up to the executive office to act as a sub for the people that were the secretaries that were taking vacation. That was in 1968. So I really struggled with whether I should go or not. I loved my job. The front office was so intimidating. I mean, there were times back in those days, we were typing memos, and sometimes we'd have to deliver it, hand deliver it. And every time I went in there, it was like everything was silent and everything was formal, and it was very intimidating. So I struggled with the decision. And then I said, oh, it's only for 3 months. You'll gain some great experience.
So Austin Tobin was the executive director in 1960.
Austin Tobin was the executive director. He was.
When did you meet him? Did you meet him in that first summer? I mean, what would have that been like? I assume it would have been intimidating. You're still a very young person in your 20s.
Yes, I was 23. He would walk past the desk and he'd kind of nod because I was at the first desk in the office. Then one lunchtime, somebody came to me and said, Mr. Tobin's secretary is out to lunch. He needs to give dictation. So they put me right in his office with him. And I must tell you that I survived, but he was very gentle. He was very humble. He was a very nice man. He must have realized I was a little bit nervous. But, I didn't feel like if I didn't get something exactly correct, I could go back and ask him. But that was a day I'll never forget.
That whole executive floor was designed to be somewhat intimidating. It was of a different culture, a different age. What was that like, even just going into that inner sanctum?
It was difficult. I was very nervous. I remember one of the first things I was shown when I arrived in the executive office were the blueprints for the World Trade Center. And construction actually started while I was there. And we had a window on the 15th floor, and we could look out the window and watch the towers rise. The office was very staid, very formal. I did, after I became more comfortable, cause a bit of a ruckus when I asked if we could wear pantsuits, since
How did
women
that go over?
Like a lead balloon. However, I went to Matt Lukens, who was the deputy executive director, and I felt very comfortable with. And I said to him, I'm not asking to wear jeans. I'm asking to wear a pantsuit. Can I please wear a pantsuit? And he said yes. And of course, Doris Landry, who was the manager of the office, had a breakdown, but he had superiority, so I wore a pantsuit. Same thing happened with mini skirts. So it was an interesting time. The other people that worked in the office, Rose Lewin, who was Austin Tobin's secretary, chief secretary, was one of the most intimidating people I have ever met in my life.
You eventually had that role for a different executive director when you were that prime person. Were you the same person, or were you just much more relaxed?
Very different, because the personalities of the executive directors were very different. Yes, I protected Peter, but people had access to him. And I'm not talking about only department directors. I'm talking about if there was somebody of a lower rank that felt like they needed to see Peter, they did. And I was much more welcoming than Rose was. And so, yes, I eventually had that role, but I did it in a very, very different way.
You have the advantage of sort of being there at the end of one golden age of the Port Authority, which would be the final years of Austin Tobin and the building of the Trade Center, which he did not move into. And there's a period of up and down, of transition, of different leaders coming in before Peter Goldmark comes in at the point where there is a scandal sort of beginning, and it becomes problematic. What was it like in between those two periods before we move into when Peter comes in, who is incredibly young, with a very strong mandate from two governors, who actually do want him to succeed?
Correct.
So what was that office, what was that front office like once, Austin Tobin is gone, the person that's associated with the agency pretty much almost from its founding, to when Goldmark comes in?
During those, I believe it was 4 years, maybe 3 or 4 years. First of all, there was a sense of worry among staff. I think there was a demoralization of staff. And I think most people felt that the agency was stagnating. We didn't have a vision or a direction. I mean, we were doing the things that needed to be done. We were operating the bridges, tunnels, and the airports and the marine terminals, but there was nothing that was visionary going on, at least from my perspective. And it was a very difficult time and worrisome.
When Peter arrived, were you his secretary from the beginning, or how did that happen? How did the two of you become a duo?
Well, after Matt Lukens left, I was left alone in the front office. And I was sitting there, and Peter walked in, and he took off his coat and he put it down, rolled up his sleeves, put a cigar in his mouth, lit it, and said, "Take me for a walk around the agency." And so I did, and I introduced him to people, and we just had an instant rapport. And so he had actually asked his secretary from Albany to come down, but she couldn't. And he very much wanted me to stay. So I stayed, and I worked alone with him for about 5 or 6 weeks. And I said to him, "Peter, this was always a 2-person office, and now we have twice the work and we only have 1 person." So he said, "We'll hire interview an assistant." So I did. But I mean, it was almost instantaneously the way we connected, got along, and worked together. And the thing that I respected most about Peter was, having worked for all these formal, staid, older individuals, Peter made me very much a part of the team. I would go to meetings with him. He always felt it was important that I knew what he was doing and what was going on. I think it was fate.
Now, the agency has moved from the point that Austin Tobin leaves. You've moved from what's now the building where Google is in. You've moved into the World Trade Center. Did you talk about, there was a kind of a demoralization because of the change? There was no strong leader at that moment. Did the culture change also because everyone left the building that had been, I hear the word Mother Panya, often, is that when the culture is shifting a bit in the agency, that you move into this new facility?
No, once we had a strong executive director, I felt the culture was the same. It was always very familial. It felt like family. And the culture didn't dramatically change at all. I never felt in my 26 years that it was not this family that I was working with.
Did you have a favorite person leave Peter aside, but when you when you think of, particularly when you were starting out, like someone that, whether it was a mentor or the person that just sort of made the tough days better.
Have you heard the name Joe Vanacore?
Yes.
Joe Vanacore was an airport engineer in aviation planning when I started. And Joe had one of the greatest senses of humor. And he always made everybody laugh and be happy. So that was one. And then Joe and I moved through the ranks kind of together. But he was a very big influence on me. Winnie Kelly, who was Matt Lucan's #1 secretary, was my mentor when I went to the front office. She taught me well. And Winnie is still alive. She's 92. And I see her every summer when I go back to New Jersey.
Talk about like your best day ever.
There's so many memorable days. I used to love to walk down what I called the Hall of Chairmen. There was a huge portrait of Austin Tobin. And then on both sides of the wall, there were pictures of all the chair people. Well, they were all chairmen. There was no women. And some of them were like from the 20s and 30s and 40s. It was just, you walk down that hallway to the boardroom. I can't tell you, I don't know what the boardroom is like now, but I can't tell you how palatial that office was. And the boardroom was palatial, and they had the agenda review room, and then they had the commissioner's ante room where cocktails were served. And it was a very different era and a very different time.
There are no cocktails, I can tell you that.
No.
With surety, there are no cocktails. You shared with me the farewell speech you gave when you left the agency and you left to follow Peter. Eventually you left, you didn't leave exactly the same time, but you did follow Peter Goldmark when he went to the Rockefeller Foundation. But you said, I arrived with the intent to stay about a year or two, gain some experience, and move uptown to something more glamorous.
Mm-hmm. I did.
So what happened? I mean, when you think back, or did you actually find something that was more glamorous right where you landed?
Oh, yes. But it really became glamorous when we moved to the Trade Center. And although I think I've talked to you about the fact that I was not really delighted that we were moving from 14th Street, I loved the Trade Center. It became my home. I watched those buildings go up. I was at the opening of Windows on the World. I was there for so many events. It wasn't glamorous, my first 6 years. It was fun. And that's why I stayed, because it was fun. I liked the work I was doing. I loved the people with whom I worked. I love the diversity of the people that worked for the Port Authority. We had blue collar, we had white collar, we had executives. I mean, I just loved the agency. I just came to really, and I still do love the agency. It was probably the highlight of my life working for the Port Authority, one of the highlights.
If someone asked you today, what exactly is the Port Authority? What does the Port Authority do? What would you tell them?
Well, since I'm not there anymore, and I'm not even in the New York area, I would tell them that the Port Authority is one of the premier public service organizations in the world, and has been studied by companies from abroad and in the United States, and has been emulated or tried to be emulated, because we always had such high standards, such integrity, such vision. And I hope and think, from what I've heard, that the Port Authority is on the right track again, and hopefully going in the same direction.
When you leave an organization and time goes by, and certainly many challenging things happen to the people at the Port Authority after you left, does it still tug at you? I mean, you probably lost friends, during that
We
You
did.
know, how does, it's a very unique place, you know, because you've been asked, people are asked to make sacrifices in the day-to-day. You work long hours, but there's also other possible sacrifices because it is the Port Authority.
Right. And I think that, yes, it tugged at my heartstrings whenever anything bad happens to the Port Authority. The 93 bombing was interesting because, well, one of my very good friends did survive, but he didn't survive 9/11. But we at the Rockefeller Foundation, Peter was getting calls all day because they weren't able to get through to people at the Port Authority. So they were calling him and asking him things. It was very, very worrisome. 9/11 probably was one of the worst days of my life. It was so personal to me. I can't even tell you how heartbroken I was. And I wasn't able to go back to ground zero until about 4 or 5 years ago. And I went back with my cousin who also worked for the Port Authority. And it was just, it's so heart-wrenching. The only thing that I found enlightening was when I came up from Path, I had no idea where I was. So the vision of what the Trade Center was is still very vivid in my mind, and I'll always hold it in my heart.
Is that perhaps the best thing, that, you know, what's been reimagined is so different? You know, that the World Trade Center is being made completely new. It's a different vision. You know,
Yes.
it's new people. It's also, though, folks who were there for, you know, there's still people here of 30, 40 years who were part of that transition, but that it's much like the airports are remade, not because of tragedy, but that there's much that's just completely reinvented.
Yes, there is. And, you know, actually, it's, I'm still in the process of accepting it the way it is. Every time I fly into Newark, I look across the river and I expect to see the Twin Towers, and I don't. And I look at the new one and I go, it's nice, but it doesn't belong there. The Twin Towers belong there. And so it's very hard. I appreciate what's been done. I think the memorial is beautiful. The pools are beautiful. I think it's very touching. The museum was incredible. There were parts of the museum I couldn't go to. But, you know, I had many friends that made it out. And, you know, it's funny, if life doesn't take certain turns, you know, it's just, I had one of my very best friends' cat was sick that morning and she took it to the vet. So, I mean, you have to kind of believe in fate.
Imagine, okay, see your 17-year-old self. You know, you're going in to this big building. It's your first day of work. You know, you've gotten past, you know, your concerns about commuting by yourself as a young woman through the bus terminal. And what would you today say to your 17-year-old person about the journey you're about to take?
I would tell her, I think personally you've made a very good choice. You're going to work for one of the premier transportation and organizations in the world. You will have many opportunities presented to you. Take advantage of them. Take the tests for promotions. Learn as much as you can about the agency. Make friends, have fun. And I think you'll have a wonderful, wonderful journey since you chose this. But I would tell that 17-year-old that I think they made a very good choice.